Hey everyone, this is Kyle Starkey, your host of Academic Bites. Just want to come on really quick to explain what was going on with this episode before it went forward. So this episode of Academic Bites was actually recorded back in April 17th in coordination with the Valerie Waksmunski-Starr Memorial Conference on the Liberal Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, also abbreviated as LAHSS-Con. A little bit of time to kind of get this going, working on my own personal research and editing it just kind of took a little bit more time. So sorry on the delay, but this episode is really cool since we're working with the conference and do just want to give a couple thank yous for the help with this episode. Dr. Amy Fluker, who had done all the planning for the conference, completely killed it, knocked it out of the park yet again. And also to Jonathan and everyone at the Steel Museum for accommodating everyone during the conference and helping me out, particularly with audio issues as we were getting this going. So the episode that you're going to be watching is going to be a roundtable that was on economics and ethics of immigration. There's going to be three speakers that you're going to see and hear, and that is Dr. Gabriel Palmer Fernandez, Emeritus Professor of Religion and Philosophy at YSU, Dr. A.J. Sumell, Professor of Economics at YSU, and Vicki Vicars, the Vice President of Operations at Thrive Mahoning Valley. Go ahead and listen to the episode. You can also watch this on YouTube. And once this episode is posted, we'll get back to our normal schedule, our normal episodes, and go from there. So thank you guys for watching. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you everyone for coming. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, isn't it? And I see a few students from my class over here. You get extra points, of course, for coming here. My remarks divide into three brief points, and what I want to do is to try and provoke an idea, and the idea is that of a fundamental natural right to free movement. My first point, an open, borderless world. Once upon a time, humans were migratory like birds and fish, and the entire globe was peopled only by their free movement. Archaeological records show the advance of hominids in Africa and Eurasia, later Homo sapiens, ourselves, beyond Africa some 90,000 years ago. It was then an open, borderless world. Later, even if rulers of ancient or classical empires had wanted clearly defined borders, they had to settle for vague frontier zones to demarcate a political space that remained always fluid and quite frequently beyond their control. Whether it was the Roman defensive limes at the edges of the empire or Hadrian's Wall, none really marked off a fixed border, but a distant liminal space in which political control ceded to distance. Much the same is true of the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, Germanic kingdoms, pre-modern Iran, Japan, among others, for example. For this very long history, the movement of people was free, unrestricted, and limited only by physical factors, banditti, they were always there, and the limits or friction of terrain. Migrations related to work throughout Europe, Italian stonecutters, German cabinet makers, long-distance seasonal workers were common in the 17th and 18th centuries. Under mercantile capitalism, these migrations were rather welcomed by the receiving communities, bringing scarce skills and increasing economic resources, and sometimes compensating for high mortality rates, famine, and war. There were also, remind ourselves, unfree migrations, that is, slave trades, like those between East Africa and India that dated from the 17th to the 19th centuries, and the chattel slavery that became an important resource for the global trade connecting Asia and the Americas through Africa. Second point, locked and sometimes kicked out by the state. Coercive control of natural, free movement was gradual, part of the long process of nation-state formation. Its initial purpose was not to keep people out, but to keep them in, to prevent emigration. As nation states emerge, people will be brought within their ambit by the power of nationalist narratives that are largely fictitious, but most importantly, dispossessing and controlling the movement of people. Their exit was essential to creating the requisite free labor for maximizing production under the class supremacy of a state-building bourgeoisie. Once locked in by the state, conditions can push some people out, and entering another's country becomes very difficult. For example, the Aliens Act of 1905, passed by British Parliament, was an important victory for opponents of the liberal Victorian policy of open immigration, especially the immigration of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. It was designed principally, Michael Dummett writes, to keep out European Jews. Exclusion and expulsion of Jews has a painful history, as illustrated by the refusal of the Cuban government to grant entry to 908 Jewish refugees in May 1939, fleeing Nazi Germany on top the luxury liner named the St. Louis. High unemployment, European fascist influences, corruption, increasing anti-Semitism, incited in part by Nazi propaganda and agitators, made for a tragic fate for many passengers of the St. Louis. Most of them had planned only for a short stay in Cuba. They had their entry visas, and they were also registered under the U.S. Immigration Act of 1924, waiting for their, quota number to come up, and then go to the United States. After negotiations failed between St. Louis Jewish committees in the U.S., and the passengers, and despite the great media attention in Europe and the Americas, St. Louis was ordered to leave Cuban waters. It was then followed by a U.S. gunboat near the Florida coast, denied entry to the U.S. and Canada, and returned to Europe in early June, where its passengers were divided among 3 nations. Just months away from the start of World War II, nearly 1/3 of them would later die in the Holocaust, mostly from the Netherlands. States have rights, some will contend, and among them is the right to control what happens with their borders, the right to exclude and to expel as part of the more general and powerful right of national self-determination. That's at the heart of the international legal system. We call it the Westphalian system. But did the Cuban government have the moral right to expel the passengers of the St. Louis? If one could speak to them, particularly those passengers later killed in the Holocaust, what would one say to them? Shall one say that we're entitled to expel you regardless of dangers and consequences because we, the people of Cuba, I'm from Cuba incidentally, the United States or Canada, have the right to self-determination? Recent expulsions by the U.S. government have a family resemblance to the expulsion of Jews from Cuba. The number of expulsions in the former are quite staggering, regardless of the party in power, Democrat or Republican. Donald Trump is not the first U.S. president to round up and deport immigrants. He would have to double the number from his first presidency to break the record, which is currently held by former President Barack Obama, of nearly 3 million expulsions, deportations in his 2 terms, with a high point of 432,000 in 2013 alone, and also ending the decades-old policy of wet feet, dry feet that allowed entry to Cubans seeking refuge in the United States. But we must say, in fairness to former President Obama, that with DACA, he did protect from deportation some 750,000 young people brought to the U.S. as children. Trump, however, has gone beyond undocumented immigrants to expelling international students, some 300 nationwide, I believe is the number that came up today. 14 from YSU alone, and at least 1 legal permanent resident, and so far as I know, these are unprecedented. Third point, provoking the right to free movement. The case for the free flow of people across borders has a strong pedigree within liberal economic theory, starting with Adam Smith, who advocated, under the principle of natural liberty, for the free circulation of labor in his great work, Wealth of Nations. And he suggested that its restriction, like restriction on the circulation of capital by guilds and monopolies, violated, and I quote Smith, one of the most sacred rights of mankind. And he goes on to write, or to prohibit a great people from making all that they can of every part of their produce, or from employing their stock and industry in the way they judge most advantageous to themselves, is a manifest violation of that most sacred right of mankind, end quote. Smith acknowledges that violations of this right had at times not been hurtful, but, and I quote him again, in a more advanced state, perhaps like ours, my editorial comment, like ours, they might be really oppressive and insupportable, end of quote. Free movement of people in the European Union today might be prefigurative of a possible alternative future. There, members of the EU come and go from one state to another for any of several reasons, whether for work, adventure, or simply a change of scene. And this freedom is enjoyed despite centuries of enmity and very bloody wars between them. Similarly, in the Mercosur trade bloc of South America, citizens of member states move freely from one country to another without visas. And the African Union's proposed protocol on free movement of persons would do much the same, allowing free movement within the African continent. Let me leave you with this thought. Imagine an all-powerful ruler who makes you the following offer. I will give you all the rights you ever want, freedom of thought, of speech, to petition government, to equal treatment, to a basic universal income, to food and shelter. You can have all of these rights only if you stay tied to this chair. Everything you would ever want, save for the right to get up and go. You will not have free, autonomous movement. You will be forever stuck in this place. Would you accept the offer? You pause and ask, what good are any of these rights if I do not have the prior right to move freely to enjoy them? What good indeed? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez, for that. So next up, we'll have Dr. Sumell coming up. I did want to say something really quick, though, in terms of the podcast. If there are students or faculty members here or people from the community that want to come on, I'm always looking for people to talk to. So don't hesitate to talk to me and even reach out through the YSU email. We can set up something from there. But with that.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Gabriel, for very interesting talk. So this is the ethics and economics of immigration, right? That's the
That is
title.
correct.
Right.
And a local perspective.
Yes, and a local perspective.
Yes.
So I'm the economics part of that. And instead of just talking about the economics, I'm going to kind of put it in the context of politics and compare what common political statements or misconceptions about immigration are relative to what the economic reality is. And there's a large divide, a big gap between the political reality around immigration and the economic reality around immigration. And that's because with politics, it's, you can often just say things that try to play off people's fears, to try to compel them to essentially to try to win votes. Whereas the economic reality is just based on facts. What does the data show as far as what the impact of immigration is? And so the first kind of common fallacy that's talked about in terms of in politics is the idea that immigrants take American jobs. That you often hear this, not just from Trump directly, but from often the Republican Party in terms of the desire to both deport immigrants and to prevent immigrants from coming, undocumented immigrants from coming, is based on, well, if we allow millions of immigrants into this country, they're going to take your jobs, as in domestic citizens. They're going to take your jobs. And this has, honestly, like a logical basis behind it. The idea that, well, for each job that I apply to, I'm competing against other people, right? So if somebody else gets that job, it means I don't get that same job. But that presumes in some ways that the number of jobs that we have is fixed, that there's just a limited number of jobs and we're all competing for the same limited number of jobs. Whereas in reality, that is nonsense. We don't have a limited number of jobs. Our economy is incredibly dynamic, and the number of jobs is constantly changing. It's like the idea of if somebody were to buy a car that I want, I can't buy that same car that that person bought, but it doesn't mean I can't buy the same car in terms of the model and the type of car, because there's millions of cars that are being produced every year. And in that same way, if somebody gets a job that I wanted, I can't get literally the same exact job, but I could get a job that's just like that job, because there's millions of jobs that are being created every year. And this is shown if you just look at, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports employment changes every month in the U.S. economy. And just last month, they reported that the U.S. economy added 228,000 jobs. That this is actually, in some ways, a gross underestimate of just how dynamic and how rapidly our economy is changing. Because it's a net figure, which means it just looks at the gross number of jobs that are created and subtracts the gross number of jobs that were destroyed each month. And the difference was 228,000. Behind that is the fact that there were actually 2,360,000 jobs created last month. Just last month, there were 2,360,000 jobs created in the US. There were 2,132,000 jobs that were lost, that were destroyed just last month. So on net, there was a positive change of 228,000 in terms of the net increase in jobs. And so it's fair to say that, well, immigrants take jobs just like domestic citizens take jobs, but they also create jobs just like domestic citizens create jobs. We all take jobs and we all create jobs, right? And so in terms of how we create jobs, or how any person, whether it's an immigrant or domestic-born person, creates jobs, it's by being a consumer and buying goods and services, and then purchasing those goods and services, well, you're buying it from a company, and those companies employ people, right? And so immigrants, just like domestic citizens, buy lots of goods and services, and there's no reason to think it's any more or any less than a typical domestic citizen would purchase. And so supporting just as many jobs. But then they also, how else can we create jobs? By starting new businesses. And the fact is, there's a number of statistics that show that immigrants are actually more likely to start new businesses than domestic citizens. They're more entrepreneurial. And so there's just two statistics that I'll point to. Approximately half of all Fortune 500 companies, so 46% of all Fortune 500 companies, which are the largest 500 companies in the US, were started by immigrants or their children, or first generation Americans. These companies include Tesla, PayPal, of course Elon Musk, DoorDash, Monster Beverage. We could go on. There's, almost 250 of them. But if you look at the gross sales of the companies that were just started by immigrants or their children, it comes to $8.6 trillion with a T. That's just of the Fortune 500 companies that were started by immigrants or their children. $8.6 trillion. That's more than double the GDP of Germany. The market cap is more than $10 trillion of just those companies that were started by, and that benefits all, investors who invest in these companies. The amount of wealth that has been generated by these companies is astonishing. And they employ more than 15 million people here in the US, just those Fortune 500 companies that were started by immigrants or their children, right? In addition to that, so that's just the Fortune 500 companies. Overall, immigrants make up 22.6% of all entrepreneurs in the US. 22.6% of all entrepreneurs, which means someone that started a new business. But they only represent 13.8% of the US population. So if we just take these two statistics together, it means that immigrants are almost twice as likely to start a new business, which would naturally be employing people, here in the US than someone that was born here in the US. You almost have twice the entrepreneurship rate, right? And so in terms of if you're just looking at the number of jobs that they quote unquote take relative to the number of jobs that they create, the number of jobs that are created by immigrants far exceeds the number of jobs that are taken by immigrants. Okay, so common misconception number 2 is, well, what about the impact on wages, right? So forgetting about the employment, the fact is if you have more people who are increasing the supply of labor, you have an increase in supply of anything, that's going to drive down prices, right? So if there's more competition for jobs, the wages of anyone who gets in any job would naturally be depressed. Other factors constant. But of course, other factors are not constant, right? And so there's a recent study, it's actually forthcoming, it hasn't even been published yet, that's forthcoming in American Economic Review, which is essentially the top journal in the economics discipline, that examined the relationship between immigration, wages, and innovation levels measured by patents for all US counties from 1965 to present. And they found that controlling for all of the other factors that can explain both wages and patents, so this would include things like education levels, number of universities, industrial composition, population, location, amenities, so all of these other factors that might influence wages and innovation levels. What they found is that foreign immigration increased both wages and innovation, other factors constant, and it was a causal relationship. So it's not just a correlation. Specifically, they found that for every 1% increase in international immigration, there was an increase in the number of patents by 1.6%, and local wages increased by 0.13%, right? It's a modest increase in local wages, but it's still a positive impact. Overall, innovation and wages are more than 5% higher than they would have been without foreign immigration. So this is for domestic citizens. That domestic citizens are being paid more than 5% more than they would have without foreign immigration, other factors constant. And in addition, they found the effects are compounding, meaning that the higher the concentration of foreign immigrants in a particular county, the greater the impact in terms of the positive impact as far as wages and innovation. So it would have a greater impact if you go from, say, 10 to 11% as far as percent of foreign-born residents in an area compared to 1 to 2%, right? Okay, so that's the second one. The third common fallacy is with regard to the fiscal impact of foreign immigrants. That the idea that immigrants can sap government resources because we have to spend in terms of on, say, SNAP benefits or for educating their children in K through 12. So the idea is that they can impose greater costs on the government than they contribute in terms of tax revenue. And to be honest, this one's a little more nuanced. It's a little more complicated because there's multiple levels of the government, right? Federal, state, local. And then you can also look at it over different time periods. But studies show that immigrants, both documented and undocumented, are net positive contributors to the federal budget. The basis of this is that less than 10% of all foreign immigrants are over age 65, and the majority of those who are over age 65 don't qualify for Social Security or Medicare. And about 75% are between ages 25 to 64, so the working age population. So they're working, paying taxes, but imposing little costs on what are inevitably the largest components of the federal budget, which is Social Security and Medicare. Right? So they're paying into the system, but drawing out much less from that same system. Studies do show that immigrants impose greater costs on state and local budgets than natives, but only in the short run, which means that because largely immigrants have more children in general than natives do, or domestic-born people do, with the larger share of them using K through 12 in public schools, which is a predominant or dominant part of state and local budgets. But that's only in the short run, while those kids are in school. Long run, what it shows, what research shows is that over their working lifetime, their tax contributions more than offset the initial fiscal burden. So you can argue that over the first 10 years for foreign immigrants who have children here in the US and are in K through 12, the costs are greater than the tax revenue. But then you have the next 40 or 50 years, where the amount of revenue that's contributed to local and state governments far exceeds the amount that is taken from them. And then the fourth and final one is the idea that immigrants increase crime rates. Of course, it's well known that Donald Trump has claimed this multiple times in many different ways. But the economic reality is that's the furthest thing from the truth. That multiple studies have shown that both documented and undocumented immigrants were arrested at significantly lower rates compared to US-born citizens. It was actually specifically half the rate for violent crimes compared to US-born, and 1/4, so 25% of the rate of US-born citizens for property crimes. And so we can take these basic economic realities and apply it to the situation in Youngstown. As we're all aware, Youngstown has had a declining population for decades, from approximately 95,000 in the city of Youngstown in 1990 to about 59,000 today. So in the last 35 years, there's been a 38% decline in Youngstown City's population. For the MSA, it's not quite as drastic, but still declining from 415,000 in 1990 to about 354,000 today, so about a 15% decline. The per capita income in Youngstown is about 21,000, which is less than half of the national average. There are exactly 0 Fortune 500 companies based here in Youngstown. We have virtually 0 patents. It's about an average of 1 per year, if you look at the Youngstown MSA, in terms of the number of patents that are filed from this area. We have crime rates that are higher than the national average. Violent crimes are 685 out of every 100,000. Property crimes are 2,876 out of 100,000. Violent crime rate for the US is 363, about half what it is in Youngstown. Property crimes are 1,916, so about 25% less than it is, or actually closer to 30% in the US compared to Youngstown. We have municipalities that are in fiscal distress, and we also have only about 2.8% of our population in Youngstown that is foreign-born, compared to the national average of 13.8%. That this is not independent. That one thing is causing the other thing, right? The fact that our foreign-born population is so low is part of why we have such a low per capita income. It's part of why we have such a low innovation rate. It's part of why we have such a high crime rate relatively. It's also a big part of why our population's declining. And so one thing that can be done to address all of these economic issues in terms of population, per capita income, innovation, crime, is to increase the number of immigrants in this area. That economic research has clearly shown that doing so would, obviously, it's going to directly increase population, but it's also going to decrease crime rates. It's also going to increase the number of new businesses that are started here, increase the number of jobs that are available here for both immigrants and domestic-born citizens. It's going to increase the wages that are associated with those jobs of both domestic residents and immigrants. And in the long run, it's going to improve the fiscal situation of our municipalities and all of Ohio. So with that, I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Sumell, I keep saying it wrong. Now we're going to have Vicki Vicars, the Vice President of Operations at Thrive Mahoning Valley. And again, when we finish up, we're going to do a little shuffling of the mics. So just use those wonderful little notepads that Stu Museum put out for you. Hold on to those questions. We'll get to you.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Dr. Sumell and Dr. Fernandez. They are both on the board of Thrive Mahoning Valley. And so I appreciate the work that they do for us and the value that they hold in our work, that they invited me to be part of this presentation. So thank you. I do apologize, I didn't put your names on my part of the presentation, so I'll fix that next time. So really what I want to do in the next few minutes is just tell you who we are, how we were founded, who we are, and what we do, particularly with relationship to immigrants and refugees, mostly in Youngstown, but the Mahoning Valley. So Christopher Colon and Justin Mondak took Emerging Leaders class at Wien Foundation pre-COVID. And at the end of that, they both wanted to really get engaged in more leadership in the Valley. At the same time, 2017, 2018, Puerto Rico was devastated by 2 hurricanes. And so there were some folks who were here already from Puerto Rico visiting who had nothing to go back to. And there were some folks in Puerto Rico that lost everything and had family or friend connections and wanted to come here. So Chris and Justin created Thrive Mahoning Valley, and their first task, their first endeavor was they set up a bilingual resource guide so that these individuals and families from Puerto Rico could find housing, employment, cars, transportation, get their kids in school, find health care. And if I had more time, I could tell you about some of the wonderful success stories they had relocating families here who are still here and very productive in our community. So that's how they founded, right? That's how they started. Those families got settled, COVID hit. And so they began to talk about how do we redirect our mission, because we're no longer resettling citizens, US citizens, by the way, from Puerto Rico. About that time, one of our board members, who also happened to be a YSU professor, moved here from Minnesota, and she was connected to an organization called Welcoming America. And Welcoming America is national, and they also have some international sites. And they really focused on building neighborhoods, and I'll tell you a little bit more about their mission later, and welcoming immigrants and refugees into the community. And so this is 2020. So Chris and Justin said, how do we build on that? How do we create welcoming communities? I think this is our mission. How do we connect people who are moving into this community and maybe residents who are already here who don't feel connected? How do we connect them to education, economic and social systems that help improve their lives so that they can thrive? So some of the programs they began creating to address those 3 areas of concerns are some of the ones that we currently have, and I have them listed here, and I want to talk just a minute about some of them. We updated our, I'll show you that on the next slide, our bilingual resource guide. So let me skip that for a second. We have, I have an eye doctor who decided that it would be smart that I have 2 different sets of glasses. Thank you. Our employee outreach program. So we've worked with companies in the Valley to translate some of their applications, to translate their safety protocols, their so Schwabels, we translated how do you bake bread in their machines so that they could hire some non-English speaking, particularly Spanish in this situation. So we're working with more employers who are open to hiring non-English speakers. And also how to, honor those particular traditions that might not necessarily be common to us. So how do we help them recognize that this person might want a different day off because they have a celebration that's not, our normal celebration. So working with that. Bikes for Adults, this program started with a YSU student. Chris and Justin met a young man who was in the Dana School of Music, and the university reached out to them to help him find housing. So they found him housing on the north side of Youngstown, but he was carrying his violin back and forth, and so we got him a bike to make it a little bit easier to carry that. That was in 2023. Since then, we've increased that program to do bikes for all adults who face transportation barriers, and just last week we gave away our 80th bike. So the bikes are donated. If you have an old bike in your garage, they're donated. We have a young man who rehabs them and fixes them up, and then we give them to anybody who doesn't have a car, who has that transportation barrier. I would say 75% of them have been international students here at YSU, but we're open to anyone in the community. And that helps people. We have a young man who's 18 who worked at a pizza place, and that's how he gets to work, is with the bike. So, the Newcomers Network, this is something we started right away, and this is one of the things I'm most proud of. When we began to look at some of the issues and some of the questions that immigrants in our community had, we recognized that there were multiple agencies who helped them. So we pulled them all together, and there's about probably 14 represented in our Newcomers Network, 14 agencies across the Valley. And we talked together about, what's missing, what are some of the things that people need that they don't have, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was that people needed legal services to adjust their status, to maybe appear in court, to fight removal proceedings, or to go from a green card to citizenship, to take citizenship classes. So we are becoming DOJ partially accredited, so that hopefully in the next couple months here we will be able to provide some of those legal services to immigrants in the community here, and we're really excited about that. The sounding board was also the Newcomers Network worked so well in that particular field of immigration. We decided to expand it because there were other nonprofits in the community and agencies. How do we work better together, right? How do we serve the entire community and the needs of the people together? So the sounding board's been meeting for about a year. Welcoming Week is a product of Welcoming America, and we spend one whole week highlighting some of the efforts in the community that make our community inclusive and welcoming. There's an art to welcoming, and one of those things is language access. So we highlight some of those things. And one of the things we did last year actually happened in this room, and we had a speaker in from Cleveland who talked about some of the same things that Dr. Sumell talked about, the economics of immigration. And one of the things I remember her saying, and I think this is reflected in what you said, and in this valley, if we look at the number of people who are set to retire between now and just 2030, just 5 years, and the number of people moving into that workforce age, we are short thousands of people. So bringing immigrants to fill in those places is something that's going to keep our community thriving. Welcoming Week, we'll post it on social media. It's a whole week full of fun things that highlight the good things the Valley's doing. Thrive Mahoning Valley is on the website, and it's a collection of stories of people who moved here, whether they are foreign born or they moved here from Nebraska, or my husband and I moved here 36 years ago from Canton. What was your experience of moving here? How have you found this community welcoming, or what have you done to include other people in the Valley? So that's a nice collection of stories. Returning citizens, we have a few interviews from returning citizens who moved here. Again, highlighting how our community includes all those who come here. And then Olafest and Cinco de Mayo are the two efforts that we have underway now that highlight some of the cultural experiences in the Valley. And I think, we leaned more towards the Hispanic and the Mexican, because if you're from here, the Italians, they've got a market on that. So, and the Slovak Fest is wonderful. So we're looking at some of the other ethnicities and cultures in the Valley, and how can we help promote them and celebrate the wonderful things that they bring to our community. I talked about language access. We just launched this. This is based off the first project that Justin and Chris did, that bilingual resource guide. So this Thrive link has that guide, but it also has a map for community resources. It has all the English learning classes that right now just Mahoning County, because it took a while to get that. We're expanding into Trumbull County. And that was good for folks who want to take those classes, you know, rather than go to every site or find them on their own. This is one landing page where they can see all the options where they can take classes. And then there's just some other things, translation services that we provide and other agencies provide. So Welcoming America, Building a Nation of Neighbors, some of the projects that we're working on with them is certified welcoming, and that's a national standard. There right now are about 25 communities, cities, and counties across the country that are certified welcoming. And that means that that community went through an audit process, and they looked at their policies, their practices, the things that they do that give access to all people. And once they pass, there's 7 frameworks within this audit. So currently, right now, we're working with the city of Youngstown to get the 1-star rating. You can get 1 to 5-star ratings. And then with that certification, that's something that businesses can use if they choose to do so, that, you know, look, our community officially is designated as welcoming, and this is why. We have language access on, you know, the water, say we have, you know, transportation that's accessible. So we're working on that. I already talked about Welcoming Week. And then the focus on immigrants and refugees. So prior to the new administration, we visited probably 5 or 6 communities and agencies that were primary refugee resettlement agencies, because that was a dream of ours, was to become a refugee resettlement agency in Mahoning Valley. There is not one here. They're in Erie and Pittsburgh and Akron and Cleveland, but there's not one here. And Dr. Sumell already talked about the benefits of having immigrants and refugees in your community, and we believe that. So one of the obstacles we faced in pursuing that, and we were doing so with another agency, was that you need to have a civil surgeon, which is just is a doctor who has the credentials to do the physical exams for refugees moving into the community. And the one that we have here is retiring. So he was reluctant to agree to that position, to identifying us as a refugee resettlement agency. There's primary refugee resettlement that work with folks for the first 90 days, and then there's a secondary refugee resettlements that work with folks after that. So the expectation is in the first 90 days that hopefully you find employment, you have your kids in school, you find housing, but you might not be completely settled. You still might need some assistance in you know, settling into that community. Of course, that all came crashing down a couple months ago. So in the meantime, we are refocusing a little bit on how we can help those who are here who are immigrants. I already talked about visiting the sites. One of the sites we visited was San Jose. We went to a conference out there, and I keep going back to Dr. Sumell. I'm sorry, what you said was brilliant too. The San Jose, the year we were there in 2023, 40% of their new businesses were started by immigrants. 40% in one community. And we just found that astounding. When we were in Dallas visiting, Dallas is home to 60 different languages. There are 60 languages spoken in the community of Dallas. So we talked about the Newcomers Network. We talked about pursuing DOJ accreditation. Immigrant-owned businesses, and we have a list. I got a list. I stole it from the League of Women Voters. They were doing some outreach to the Asian and Pacific Islander community. And so they had a list of those businesses in Mahoning and Trumbull County. This is just Asian and Pacific Islander. There are 41 businesses in Mahoning County that are owned by folks with that ethnic designation, and another 27 in Trumbull County. And there's actually 8 identified here on campus YSU, so those are student groups, you know, that cater to the API community. That's not including Mexican, you know, or any other ethnicity in the community. So one of our things that we wanted to do is really support and uplift those businesses. I think you would maybe all agree that there's a negative narrative surrounding folks who are immigrants, and sometimes that impacts their business, right? So we wanted to highlight and contribute in kind of showcase the wonderful things that they do in our community. So we have that list. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the Cinco de Mayo Festival here on May 4th, actually. It'll be a showcase of food and culture and music and art, and some of those Mexican restaurants will be here. We also are, when the student visas began to be revoked on campus, we put out a Facebook message that we were here for those students, that we would do what we can. And I think last I checked, that was shared 90 times, and we've been contacted by media by several of those students themselves. And so we're doing what we can to support them. We may not be able to change the situation, but we want them to know that our hearts are with them, and while they're still here, if they have any needs, we can assist them. Some of the ones that we've talked to are afraid to leave their apartments. They're afraid to go outside of their comfort zone. So we've been trying to support them the best that we can. Finding legal services has been a challenge because a lot of legal immigration attorneys, we have one in Youngstown, and she works for Community Legal Aid. And she's limited by the income of the folks the people that she works with. And they don't work with student visas at all. That's typically not something that a student needs an attorney for. So we're looking to Cleveland and Columbus for information and resources about, how we can be helpful to those students. Your known businesses. Oops, and that was from another presentation. So I think that covers a lot of what we do. Keeps us busy, keeps me out of trouble. So.
You raise money.
How do we raise money?
Yeah.
We do have an account. So one of the other things that we're doing in the community is during the previous Trump administration, this is what you're talking about?
Just donations?
Yeah, we take donations all the time. We don't have any federal funds. So right now we feel like we can freely speak and say what we need to without the risk of losing federal funds. But we are grant funded, private donations and things like that. The bike runs on donations, the program. But the other thing that we're going to start collecting money for is, if the students need to go home, when it is time for them to leave, if they need plane tickets. Or right now, CoreCivic has approximately, last I heard just last week from our immigration attorney, 200 detainees. And I believe Mahoning County Jail has close to 30 immigrant detainees. During the previous Trump administration, when the detainees were released, and most of these folks had valid asylum cases. So when the prison determined that, okay, they have a legal cause, they don't need to be in prison, they just took them to the bus station, usually with a t-shirt and shorts on or flip-flops. And so there was a group of people who met them and made sure that they had food to travel with, made sure they knew where they were going, maybe provided interpretation services so they could get the ticket to where they were going. So that group has started up again, and we're helping them. And so we have a small pot of money to pay for food or a bus ticket, or if they need that. So yes, we're always accepting donations. Thank you. All right, thank you.
All right, y'all, give me 1 second, and then we can go ahead and take any questions. Good.
Questions?
Podcast recording. Let's get some participation.
Okay, so this is primarily directed to Dr. Palmer Fernandez, but all of you can answer, obviously. So I agree with the base proposition that you offered regarding open borders and ethical free movement being a basic human right. However, what do you think of the balancing act that has to be put on, given that we have a capitalist system and with movement across borders of people that are in this quasi part of the body politic, but not fully part of the body politic as citizens, they become targets for exploitation in different industries. We see in the agricultural sector, undocumented immigrants are, doing back-breaking labor, hours a day, hardly any wages being earned. So how do you balance the ethical preference for free movement against the ethical duty not to allow and encourage exploitation to occur?
Yeah, thank you. So your point, your concern is that if we follow a right to free movement position, it exposes those who move to unethical practices and exploitations. So how do you balance? Pardon?
I said that was put much better than how I asked it.
Oh. So the point is how to balance one right against what we would call in the business a positive right to free movement and a negative right not to be exploited. Right? I don't know. But I think that we have some historical examples that we can draw upon from Mercosur, what I described in South America, the trading bloc, Bolivia, Brazil. There are about 11 countries, I think, in and out. Argentina. Similarly with the European Union, that's those who might be, subsistence farmers in southern Spain, might travel up to, in an open borders, travel up to Germany, right, and be exploited there as laborers and so on. I don't know how they handle that, if at all, or whether it's an issue. Right? So I don't know how we would balance one right against another. And for those who are here that have some experience with philosophical discourse, it's one of the most impossible things to do. Dr. Alan Tomhaven and a couple of students from our class, the rights it's very difficult to trade them off against each other. So that's the best I can do today.
So I would just add a little on, not the philosophical part, but the economic part. That there was a study, came out about a decade ago, that actually looked at or estimated what the impact would be if there were open borders. So people were just allowed to travel freely between countries without restriction. What the estimated impact would be. And it was that per capita incomes worldwide would increase by more than 40%. So average income per person would go up by more than 40% as a result of people being allowed to freely move between nations. In addition to that, if you think of, and it's a very good question in terms of exploitation, but I'd point out that when people are exploited here in, say, in the US as a result of being undocumented, you can also compare it to relative to what their situation was before they came to the US. And it's arguable that in some cases, I have no doubt that they're being exploited here in the US, but their conditions might actually be better. And so if you look at this also from a world international perspective, the fact is we still have about 1 billion people who survive on less than $2 per day. And the most effective thing that we could do to address that, to reduce that, just staggering level of poverty, is to allow people to move between borders. In that paper, it did also estimate the impact to that global poverty rate would be cut by more than 50% if we allowed people to just move out of those situations where they're stuck in that degree of poverty.
So I guess kind
One more
of,
little point, if I may, Alan. Sorry. I do wonder whether the removal of obstacles for the free movement of people actually might reduce exploitation to the destination.
I guess I was wondering actually on specifically that point was how much of the exploitation that actually occurs is because of illegal status. And and if we reduce those barriers, if we actually just allowed for the free movement, you kind of wipe out that
Right.
sort of secret,
mechanism.
you know, yeah, so you get rid of the exploitation.
Right, yeah, thank you.
May I add one comment to that? The tidbit of information that I forgot to share is that in the state of Ohio, there are 76 farm businesses, and that includes wineries, that apply for the H-1 visa, which is the seasonal agricultural workers. And I think that you could probably name the ones in this community that have those seasonal workers. The state of Ohio dictates that they have to pay between $18 and $19 an hour. So they're getting, you know, it's not a tremendous wage, but it's a decent wage. That does not include roofers or nurseries. And I happened to speak to a nursery business earlier this spring who wanted to hire 80 seasonal workers from Mexico. And because of the way the lottery system works, he was only allowed to hire 30 legally. So the INA, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, is 35, 25, 60 years old. So I think, you know, if not free movement, maybe revised, better laws, yeah, would also help with that.
This is primarily, I guess, towards Dr. Sumell, or Dr. Sumell. Seminelli's in the history department, my bad. You noted the studies where increased immigrants led to increased, like, especially entrepreneurial, increased business. Is there any sort of reason for that? Or, because I was thinking maybe like increased culture, variety equals increased creativity. Is there any sort of basis to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The research I looked at didn't explain why. It just, you know, essentially was just an objective analysis of what the facts are. But I think yours is a fair hypothesis. I think in part, you know, and I talked about how the study shows that the concentration of foreign immigrants in an area increases the rate at which GDP increases or incomes increases, wages increase, and also entrepreneurial activity increases. And I think that's part of, yeah, that at some point it's changing the culture and changing the, you know, diverse exchange of ideas and thoughts, and which just is conducive towards creativity and entrepreneurship. I think a more, how do I say, logistical reason for it is also just based on, in some ways, they in some ways have to more, right? To start their own businesses, to generate their own incomes, rather than just going and applying for, you know, a job at a, say, manufacturing plant or at a, whatever, educational facility. That they're more limited towards legal opportunities, and so they need to start their own in order to generate their own income. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of factors, but that is definitely one of them.
So, Dr. Sumell, you were talking about, you know, the perception that immigrants are displacing people from their jobs, and like, to the extent that that does happen, there's no reason to think that another job might be created. And like, I get why that's not an economic problem from an economic perspective, but like, I'm increasingly receptive to the idea that, like, I don't know, people have like a lot of identity tied up in the work that they do, and they're like, I do this is me, and like they do that for 20 years. And so maybe at the end of that economic transformation that happens, where the line of work that this hypothetical guy was in, and then he finds another job, but maybe then you have a political problem where this person is now receptive to like a reactionary authoritarian, so I don't know. How do you design policy or like think about tweaks to the safety net that like might?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's a tough one, because I think in the end, it's, as I said, the political narrative is so different from the economics, because the economics is always more nuanced, and the political narrative doesn't really allow for that nuance, right? That it is easy to look at and just think, logically, well, we have millions of people coming in, they're going to need jobs. They're going to take my job, and not actually consider the fact that it's not your job that's at risk. It's they're going to need jobs, it's true, but they're also going to be generating jobs as they come in, right? And so that's hard to put on like a bumper sticker, you know what I mean? Or make part of a political campaign. Like, yeah, they're going to be creating millions of jobs, and they're going to be taking millions of jobs, just like all of us are creating jobs and taking jobs, right? And so it's just much harder, I think, to relay in a political way that's effective. And I don't know how you do that, honestly. And so I think that's the issue, right? And that's why it's effective in terms of politically to play on those concerns.
May I ask a question, or you've got one over there?
I have a question. I think you'll like it.
Okay, Ash, thank you.
So, because I'm currently obsessed with private property, and you taught me that states have a monopoly on violence. And city-states essentially are protecting our private property, if I'm getting it right. So wouldn't this have to force an adjustment on how we define the state? Because if the goal is to, because I'm all for free movement, because I think it creates places where we can see abundant growth and transformation in culture, which provides higher education and resources and less goods, because if people are more nomadic, they are less sedentary and need less things. But wouldn't that have to redefine the state itself away from that monopoly towards violence and protecting that private property for this goal to even be achieved, and for an assimilation where welcoming is the key instead of setting up walls to keep people away?
Thank you, Ash. You had two questions, by the way, because you did the hospitality at the end there, welcoming. So I'm not going to go there. It was not my definition of a state. Is the German economist, sociologist Max Weber, who defined the monopoly of legitimate violence over a territory, right? Surely if that's our conception of a state, particularly of that doctrine, that magic that we call sovereignty, right, with the capacity to exclude and to expel from your territory, then how we understand the state today might evolve. But we're seeing in 3 parts of the world that I pointed to, in the European Union, in South America, and the proposed protocol in Africa, it's not in place, right? We're seeing that states are able to adjust here, right, to the movement of people, just as an example of a possible alternative future. Okay, thank you. I have a question. Yeah, may I ask a question to my friend and colleague over here? As I mentioned, I'm from Cuba, and back some years ago, many years ago, in South Florida and Miami, there were some very bad tensions between Cuban refugees and the local African-American communities, because there was a displacement, right, of employment. So it seemed that my people coming here exacerbated the problems that were already there, the problems of racism. So I wonder whether you've run into any data, right, that looks at immigrant groups and then resident minority groups and
Yeah.
the effect there on economics.
Yeah. So there are studies that look at specifically both, I think, by race and more, the ones that I am more aware of are just stratifying the effects by income levels. And the fact is, it does have different effects in terms of immigration has different effects towards different income classes. And the positive effects generally are towards higher income classes. And it doesn't mean that lower income classes have negative effects, it just means it's not quite as positive, right? And so there can be more of a, I guess, a displacement argument around, you know, for lower income, those that have, say, less than a high school degree or only a high school degree, there's more of a concern. And I think that's part of why, you know, the current narrative has been more effective towards, you know, working class. Because a large proportion of the immigrant population also has a high school degree or less than a high school degree, right? But I would ask in relation to that, if that's, because I think it's interesting, because that's based, you said, on your history. Do you think that's still the situation? Is there still that conflict, or has it been that over time what happens is...
In South Florida?
Yeah.
No.
Right.
No.
That over time they
Cubans just
assimilate
took it over.
and you know,
Yeah, no.
and they become part of the culture, and I think...
Right.
Well, so I actually did a paper, a presentation on immigration that Dr. Palmer Fernandez actually organized. And I got the same question or similar question, but it wasn't about Florida, it was about other populations. So when you have movements of people north where certain minoritized populations have sort of isolated, or not isolated, but come together, and then you have other immigrant populations moving in, then you might actually, so I don't know if it's happening in Florida, but then it just sort of moves the location where it might actually be happening. So that there's certain job classifications that actually might exacerbate the conflicts when new populations come in that start to take that class, in quotes, of jobs.
Right.
And it actually makes me think about like the low education levels, and then I'm thinking about the Mahoning Valley and what the education levels are here, and then what kind of impact that might have, and if it might actually cause some conflict that we might have. I don't know if that's all three of you or what, but.
So we are actually going to a conference in Detroit in May, and there's an organization up there that's doing cross-cultural work with the Black community and Somali immigrants on this very thing. So I'll bring you back some information from there. Yeah.
So for sake of time, that is going to be our last question. So if we could just get another round of applause for our panel up here. And we can keep that applause rolling for, again, Dr. Fluker setting this up in the Steel Museum. We'll keep it going for them. Yeah, okay. And then last shameless plug, because I swear I want this to keep going. This was beautiful. Thank you for the participation. Look for Academic Bites on Spotify. In the future, the next episode that we're lining up is going to be on Bigfoot. So a drastic shift. And then over the summer as well, I'm going to do a little shameless work myself and talk about my dissertation research that I'm going to be defending over the summer. So if you are at all interested in that, look for those on Spotify. The video I'm going to be putting up on YouTube. It'll go around to all the social medias at YSU. So again, guys, thank you for participating too.